to introduce the speaker to you. And I'm not going to go into how many degrees he has or what school he went to and all this other stuff. Y'all already know that. Because I want to introduce to you a man that I have loved for the last 7 years. And this man, I'd rather not say man, but this spirit, because we all are spiritual beings having a human experience. He has been a part of my life, and we have grown together, physically, emotionally, and most of all, spiritually. And as we have grown together, he's been there when I had struggles. I've been there with him when he had struggles. He's been the shoulder that I have leaned on and that I have come to trust. And I give thanks for it. I don't want to start crying when I do this. But he means a lot to me. And I'm just so blessed to have him in my life. And I'm blessed because I wake up every day with him. And in that waking up, there's always something that either he has to say that he's come up with. I said, oh, did you rest good last night? Did you dream? And he's always greets me in love. And you can never, never go wrong when you have someone to share your life with, as we have come to know through everything that there is. Not only is he that, he practices what he preaches. And sure, there are struggles, and sometimes he has to go through this and through that. But when you come back out of the other side of it, I'm there for him, and he's there for me. And most of all, the divine is here for me. So I want you all to give a warm welcome to your speaker, Elroy Boyd III.
Good morning. Thank you for having me to speak before you this morning. And look, when we begin, as we start this, I'm going to begin with a disclaimer. And with love, with L-O-V-E, I will be this morning what the young people say, keeping it real. Okay? So I'm going to say some things that need to be said, and also understand that all of this is blanketed in love. So do we understand that? Or we are in accord with that? Wonderful. Well, as you know, that this is African American History Month. This is the annual celebration of remembering those Americans of African heritage who have contributed to the building of the cultural history of this nation. And to these ancestors, we say thank you. And Yemaja and I are grateful to celebrate this observance with you at Unity of Richmond this year. And so we would like to thank all of you. Thank you. And how did we get here? Well, all of this started in December of 2018 when we were moving into a new apartment. Now, as I know everyone in here knows, moving is a pain. It is just a pain. And boy, I really thought, wow, it's going to be something because we were just literally going around the corner. Not so. The week that we were moving, there was a snowstorm, and I caught sick in the middle of moving, and it was just a major mess. Now, after we got situated, after we were all nestled in and enjoying our new dig, so to speak, I had to recover. I had to recover. Some days I didn't have any help. Some days I had to do it by myself, and I was sick, and I was in the snow. My feet would be full of water and ice at the end of the day. It was really something. So I slept, and I slept for a good 3, 4, 5 days. Yemaja was staying up all night watching YouTube in the living room, okay? And for some reason, she got on sort of the visual cycle. You know how YouTube operates. She got on the visual cycle of the Founding Fathers. And she came across the 1998 film of Thomas Jefferson by Ken Burns. Now, I love Ken Burns. I have the film, but I haven't looked at it in about 20 years. She woke me up one morning. She said, Roy, you have got, come over here. You have got to look at this. And it was the portion of the film in which Burns points out some of the disturbing things that Jefferson wrote about the African from his publication, his 1785 publication, Notes on the States of Virginia. Now, some of you probably know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but I am going to be fair this morning. And to be fair, I must state this. Jefferson did constantly speak out against slavery. He did work to gradually end the practice of slavery, while he owned throughout his lifetime 600 enslaved Africans throughout his lifetime. And he freed only 7. In an earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Jefferson wrote of the British King, King George, quote, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation. Determined to keep open a market where men should be brought and sold. Now, that passage that I just read to you, he was advised by his colleagues to omit it from the original document, and that is why it is not in the final draft of the Declaration of Independence today. In 1779, he did support gradual emancipation. Now, this proposal meant that he supported the training and colonization of enslaved Africans in lieu of unrestricted emancipation. In 1784, Jefferson proposed federal legislation banning slavery in the new territories of the North and the South after 1800. This proposal failed to pass Congress by 1 vote. So, all of these actions and viewpoints articulated into historical and political writings come in direct opposition of his position of a colonial gentleman. Now, in 1773, as the result of the passing of his father-in-law, Jefferson inherits 2 plantations, 135 enslaved Africans. So, by 1776, Jefferson was, in distinction, in both landmass and in monetary wealth, one of the largest planters in the Virginia colony. Now, this brings us to the volume, Notes on the State of Virginia. It was published in 1785, and what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence 9 years earlier was contradictory to what he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia. He was conflicted, internally conflicted by this contraposition in his life, and I will quote to you from Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, and this is what he wrote in the section entitled Laws. And I quote, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Now he continues. Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on their face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. Now, this man was a giant in the humanities of American history. Now, he was a lawyer, was a statesman, diplomat, an architect, and a founding father, as well as the 3rd president of the United States. Now, this was a true Renaissance man. So it is no wonder why the historian John Hope Franklin, in response to Jefferson's treatise, said, quote, It makes it less easy to understand how a man of this gigantic intellectual powers and so forth could fritter away his time speculating about how blacks smell and how they reason and that sort of thing. Dr. Franklin also noted that Jefferson knew what he was doing, and the transgressions he committed were the transgressions of the mind as well as the heart. And I would like for you to meditate a little bit this morning on this message for our Black History Month celebration here at Unity Richmond. This subject, transgressions of the heart and the mind. Transgressions of the heart and the mind. Now, to begin with, I would like to call your attention, we're going to go way back, I would like to call your attention to the 1st century AD. Between the years of 57 AD to 54 AD, I would like to begin with the book of Romans. Let's go back to the book of Romans, chapter 4, verse 15, where it is written, "For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression." Now, I am going to do something, and I want you to hear me out. I am going to challenge this Paulist philosophy where Paul writes, where there is no law. I am going to be so bold to say unto you that there is a law, okay? The law is present. The law does exist. It is a universal law, and that law is love. Do you hear me? In The Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes wrote, "Love rules through law." Love is the divine givenness. Love is the way. Law is the way. Love is spontaneous. Law is impersonal. Love points the way, and law makes the way possible. Universally, we understand love as an emotion coming from where? Yes, and physically, from the heart. On law, Holmes also states that the road to freedom lies not through mysteries or occult performances, but through the intelligent use of nature's forces and laws. The law of mind is a natural law in the spirit world. We have to remember that Jefferson and many of the founding fathers were strongly influenced by the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And this philosophy influenced the founding fathers' ideas of the two opposing issues, which were African enslavement and American freedom. Enlightenment thinkers believed that liberty was a natural birthright. So here I'm going to give to you the 4 basic convictions of the European Enlightenment. Number 1, human beings are the source of value, by the implication that the human is the source of value by God. Number 2, reason is sufficient to solve all problems, especially scientific reason. Number 3, while religion may have a place in one's personal life, it is not a good thing for it to be intertwined in public life, especially in decisions that involve the larger community, the larger political community. And number 4, progressivism. The idea that history is the story of human progress. Now, what is interesting here is that the problem with Jefferson and the rest of his Enlightenment contemporaries is very often in their writings, when they are speaking of the human, they are only speaking of the European. Humanity is limited. Now, this could be traced all the way back to Aristotle in 340 BC. Aristotle wrote that while the Greeks are by nature free, hear me out now, while the Greeks are free by nature, barbarians, meaning non-Greeks, are slaves by nature. And what this means is it is in the nature of the non-Greek to be submissive to a single ruler with absolute power. Now, Aristotle wrote this in his book, Politics, and he reasoned that natural slaves are those who possess strong bodies and slave souls, meaning that they are unfit for independence and they are unintelligent, respectively. Not only does this imply the physical basis for discrimination, but it also becomes the precursor for modern racism. So today, there is a difficulty in discussing the race issue because if one is going to talk about the idea that one group of people is superior to another group of people, meaning one group of people are human and the other group of people are inferior or non-human, then the political doctrine of liberalism, the belief that the government is necessary to protect individuals from being harmed by others, does not pertain to the ones perceived as non-human, a transgression of the heart and the mind. Now, this philosophical movement, the Enlightenment, was weighty, shall we say, intellectual enterprise in its widely disseminating influence in Europe and later in America. Educated men believed that they were illuminating human intellect and culture after the Dark Ages, now much in the same way that the European Renaissance broke away from its medieval past. And because of the conviction that religion or spirituality should not be intertwined in public or political life, responding to the previous century's religious conflict in Europe and being the precursor of what will later become in this country, the separation between church and state. The idea toward the secularization of religious ideas played a very important part in the religious opposition to the institution of slavery. Now, this was according to the publication Anti-Slavery and the Enlightenment in Early America. Now, despite all of this, there still had to be a justification, a religious justification to uphold the abhorrent practice of slavery. And that justification was through, ladies and gentlemen, Christianity. Most slaveholders identified themselves as Christian. And within the Holy Bible, there were two commonly used scriptures to justify their deeds. The first one comes from the 9th chapter of Genesis, verses 18 through 27, which reads, "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." So, because of this curse, people who are of a darker hue are cursed by the Lord thy God, and therefore are considered non-human and needed to be under the order and rule of those humans who are, according to the Enlightenment, are the source of value by God. The other biblical example behind the justification of slavery and racism, white supremacy, comes from the Apostle Paul in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, verses 5 through 7. "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he be received of the Lord, whether he be bond or free." Now, this is just the biblical justification alone. Now, in this instance, in the instance of religion, these colonial gentlemen contradicted themselves by putting into the law of state the religious aspects of slavery and racism, white supremacy. In September 1667, a statute was declared right here in Virginia, right here in Richmond, that the baptism of slaves does not exempt them from bondage. This is the statute. "Partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should, by virtue of their baptism, be made free. It is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, that diverse masters freed from this doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by admitted to that sacrament. Baptism should make no difference in a slave's condition in life, Christian baptism should not be allowed to threaten human bondage, nor should human bondage be allowed to threaten Christianity. A transgression of the heart and the mind. Just this past December, the Southern Baptist Convention released a 71-page report on the role that racism and their support for slavery played in its origin and growth. A transgression of the heart and the mind. Now, in the late 18th century, there was talk of abolishing the slave trade. And there was, to many who studied history, the belief that those colonial gentlemen were coming to terms with their transgressions and believed that, they were finally going to be benevolent. Well, by 1776, there were 190,000 enslaved Africans in Virginia alone, and over 350,000 by 1800. And by the eve of the Civil War, nearly 500,000. Many Africans were brought to Virginia between 1619 and 1778, and they were uprooted violently from their African communities and transferred to a strange new world that held little or no promise for them. And so another statute was passed in 1778 that prohibited the further importation of enslaved Africans. So there was this feeling of benevolence, according to the scholars of history, that there was an ending to the importation. But you see, there was a method to the madness. Slavery still thrived in Virginia after 1778, with Virginia becoming the leading breeder state. And because of this, Virginia's richest slaveholders could be the only slave dealers. You see, the law changed, but the narrative didn't change. Now, you keep that in mind, because I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. Now, I brought that up because I want to tell you a little something that occurred to me a little more than 25 years ago. In 1993, we were visiting South Carolina, and my father brought me to the Hampton Plantation. Now, this was a plantation about a little more than 30 miles away from Charleston, South Carolina. And my father told me that this was the plantation from where I descended from. This lovely lady here, Frances Pinckney, her namesake comes from Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. And he was descended from Eliza Lucas Pinckney, a businesswoman in South Carolina who single-handedly turned around the whole indigo industry and made it into a cash crop. Now, I'm going to warn you. I told you I'm going to say some things that need to be said, okay? Now, there's a funny thing about Mr. Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. He committed what William Robinson once said, a little late-night tipping in the back of the plantation, which is how we are where we are today, okay? Why did I bring that up? I brought that up because Cotesworth Pinckney later became a representative in the lower house of South Carolina, and he agreed to abolish the slave trade in 1808 for the same reason, breeding for economic gain. He changed the law, but he did not change the narrative. Pinckney later went on to oppose emancipation in 1801. Pinckney himself owned 250 enslaved Africans, and his mother was given 50 slaves upon the death of her father. Her father left the remaining slaves to his daughters and nephews. So my ancestors were wedding gifts and bequests by will or legacy, a transgression of the heart and the mind. Before January 1st, 1863, the government of the United States of America noted that it was legal to hold Africans enslaved for perpetuity, meaning perpetually or forever. Transgression of the heart and the mind. And the creating of the Constitution, the government considered enslaved Africans 3/5 of a human being in order to give the southern states and a third more seats in Congress. and a third more electoral votes than if the enslaved had been ignored. A transgression of the heart and the mind. In his 1854 Peoria speech, Abraham Lincoln mentioned that the government equated the humanity of the American Negro to a hog owned by its farmer. A transgression of the mind and the heart. Judge Roger Taney, who had heard the Dred Scott decision, declared that no African, free or enslaved, had ever enjoyed the rights of a citizen, and that African Americans are, quote, regarded as beings of an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. A transgression of the heart and the mind. In the years following the Civil War, the southern states of this country passed the Black Codes, a series of laws passed with the intention of restricting the freedom of the African American, making them work in low-wage jobs and in a hard-working labor economy, keeping them from acquiring economic power and education. A transgression of the heart and the mind. Marian Anderson was not allowed to perform at Constitution Hall, prompting Eleanor Roosevelt to resign from the Daughters of the American Revolution. A transgression of the heart and the mind. And my father, God rest his beautiful soul, was enlisted in the 1317 Engineering Unit from Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and it was a segregated unit. And it was a segregated unit because the government would not allow integrated units before Harry Truman. A transgression of the heart and the mind. Carolyn Bennett Dunham claimed in 1955 Emmett Till whistled at her. So what? So her husband and her brother-in-law and other men took Till and lynched him, and his body was left in a grotesque state, witnessed by all the world. 62 years later, Carolyn Bennett told the world she lied, and she's still walking around free. A transgression of the heart and the mind. And now you have police brutality, a transgression of the heart and the mind. So now the question arises, what do we do when we openly admit to a transgression? What do we do when we openly commit a transgression? Well, Hinduism teaches us that while we are on the path, we should know that the universe is running on principles. Universal principles and universal laws of karma governed by the omnipresent divine. So it would behoove us to pursue divine union to the source with great reverence. Whether it is in the form of a spiritual practice as yoga, meditation, affirmative prayer. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna repeatedly emphasized for us to fix our minds upon God. And as we do so, we remain absorbed in God. And the more absorbed in God, the more we are in divine union. And when you are in divine union, your chakras are synced, your senses are all in a synchrony, and everything internal is aligned, and we move in mindfulness. Why is it up to us as opposed to what is taught in the mainstream about how we are to be ashamed and guilt-ridden over a transgression? Hinduism once again teaches us that we are not punished by God if a spiritual transgression has been committed. The damage is done by our own mind. So our mind is tainted with superiority, inferiority, discrimination, intimidation, scandal, lynching, and bondage. And in this practice, it is expected for the transgressor to admit their mistake and simply look to themselves for forgiveness. Go into self, face your transgression, and simply resolve to never make that mistake again. Now, I mentioned earlier about changing the narrative. That is what this is about. That is what the Reverend Dr. Michael Beckworth mentioned. All of that is called changing the narrative. In religious science, Holmes pointed out that there is no sin but ignorance. I'm going to repeat that again. There is no sin but ignorance. Ignorance is the only sin there is, said Holmes. It creates hell, devils, limitation, and sickness. Racism, white supremacy is a sickness. It is a sickness caused by ignorance. And by result, racism, white supremacy is a sickness, and there is no punishment but a consequence. There is no punishment but a consequence. Please remember this, those of you who harm your brothers and sisters. The question is, how do we cure the sickness? Holmes goes on to state, as we correct our mistakes, we forgive our own sins. I'm going to repeat that again. As we correct our own mistakes, we forgive our own sins. You change the narrative. And before all of that, and before all of this, we have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to learn that all we being taught was wrong. Change the narrative. The filthy, systematic racism that we picked up along the way from friends, family, newspaper, media, advertising. That's right, I said it. It's just simply wrong. The false science of eugenics is wrong. Wrong and evil. Change the narrative. And we have to be willing to open our minds. Learn from the other side of the fence. Paul himself said, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Change the narrative of that so-called status quo you are meant to challenge. This narrative that Dr. Beckworth calls it, this narrative that Dr. Beckworth calls it, is for us to recognize that every single one of us are God's children. Take the time right now and look around the sanctuary. All of you, all of us, look around. Look at all these beautiful colors. You heard of the United Colors of Benetton? Well, this is the United Colors of God, baby. Okay? And what a wonderful time to recognize this now. What a wonderful time to change the narrative now. This month, February, the month where we can recognize the contributions of African Americans that have been overlooked, suppressed, and ignored from the pages of mainstream history. The writers of history, and especially in our schools. And that can be said when so many states are refusing to have the word slavery in their textbooks. Reverend Beckworth recently stated that this is Black History Month, but America would not be where it is without free labor, baby. This is American History Month. The law can change, but it don't mean a hill of beans if you don't change the narrative. We have to make the power shift. And we have the power to make the shift. These times right now, with our divine energy, we can do this because we are extensions and expressions of the divine. And we can change the energy and we can change the narrative. Forgive your brother, forgive your sister, change the narrative. And I'm going to end with this. Dr. John Hope Franklin did come to terms with his feelings about President Jefferson, and he stated, I am a forgiving man, therefore I forgive him for what he did. But I remember that what he did was a transgression against mankind. This is African American History Month, a celebration of the building of America.
Y'all can show some more love, 'cause that was good. Show some love. That was good. So y'all got it. Y'all got it. Y'all got the real deal today. There was no chocolate put on it. There was no vanilla flavoring put in it. There was no watering down of it. And you can go check those facts. So take it in. Sometimes when we hear truth, it's hard to swallow. But somebody got to do it.